Now, I think it will be up to the audience in great part to raise the searching questions that are needed to bring points of view at least into focus, if not together. And we have arranged the program in such a way that there's ample opportunity for that to take place. Now, a word or two about the other things that are going on in the room. You see cameras that are attempting to put this material in more permanent form to stretch the dollar, so to speak, and make the outcomes of this conference available for educational purposes exclusively throughout the country once the program is finished. Selected programs that take place in this auditorium are the ones that will be filmed. I have a few announcements, but before that I'd like to take this opportunity before it gets lost in the shuffle to express my own gratitude and that of the conference participants to the National Institute of Mental Health, who has in part provided the funds to make the conference possible. And in particular, because I know people like this get really lost in the shuffle, I'd like to take this moment to thank Carl Anderson of the National Institute of Mental Health, the man on the other end of the telephone whenever I needed him in getting this thing set up. So that's the only plug we'll have today. Now a few announcements. Luncheon tickets may be purchased at the break. Emergency calls for physicians in the audience will be Granite 89711, extension 3661. Tomorrow we change time. Don't forget to set your clock ahead. A word or two about program. Section A, the concurrence of the concurrent sessions, you might consult your program, will meet in room 121 of the Economics Building instead of the former place. 121 Economics Building. Section B will meet in this auditorium. Section C will meet in the Economics Building as well, in room 147. Lunch this noon will be in the Faculty Center. Just follow the speakers here, I think. The lunch on Sunday tomorrow will be in the Student Union. I'm now ready to bring to your attention the rest of the people on the platform with me. First person I'd like to introduce is the person who is responsible for all this at this end, not in the sense that he is the master pusher of Los Angeles and environment, but a very dear and close friend, Dr. Thomas Sternberg, Assistant Dean, Postgraduate Medical Education, and Professor of Medicine at UCLA.
Thank you, Dr. Wilner. I haven't been entirely certain the last few days whether Dr. Wilner would ever speak to me again. As usual with conferences, there are all kinds of last-minute problems and crises, and we seem to have arrived at this point with none of them being fatal, at least as far as your coronary arteries are concerned. In planning this conference, it was hoped that the forum of a major university where all of the various aspects of this tremendous problem could be freely debated would be not only a benefit, but might be actually highly desirable in respect to the overall consideration of one of California's and one of the nation's big problems. We had a number of meetings a year ago and 9 months ago to discuss first whether or not to go into this, because it is a lot of work, I know, as you realize, and there are problems, some of which are difficult to handle. And after a great deal of discussion, and particularly by the steering committee, which is on the back of your program, and I won't take the time to mention these people by name, but I hope that all of you, and I'm sure that you are acquainted with most of these people, and with the support of Dr. Lenore Gerke, who is the Dean of the School of Public Health here, we were able to get this program underway. At this point, two main problems occurred. One of them was money. I might say the first one was money. And some of you may say, well, that's your last one. And of course, people. The money, as Dr. Wilner mentioned, was furnished through a grant from the National Institute of Mental Health, specifically for this conference, for which we are quite grateful. The people also came through the impetus of the steering committee and Dr. Gerke, and particularly the chairman of the program committee, the man who has been working on this program now almost full time for several months, and who I wish to give my sincere appreciation and thanks, Dr. Daniel Wilner.
For the School of Law, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Murray Schwartz, Professor of Law, who will speak for Dean Maxwell.
I hope you don't think this program or conference is getting off to a false start, since Dean Maxwell is listed as representing the law school. As Dan Wilner has said, I am not Dean Maxwell. However, I do stand in his stead this morning, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this conference on his behalf, on behalf of the law school, and more expansively, on behalf of the entire legal academic world, and perhaps the private practice legal world. I will leave it to the Attorney General to welcome you on behalf of the public legal world. It appears from an examination of the program that, with the exception of the Attorney General, and also with the exception of Professor Frank Allen of the University of Michigan Law School, that the list of formal participants contains no lawyers. This seems to me as it should be. First, because the two gentlemen I have just named quite clearly can hold up the law's end in any conference, but more important, because whatever the law does, it must be based upon the medical, sociological, and psychological considerations to which this conference in the main is going to address itself. And for these reasons, we wish you well and welcome you to UCLA. Thank you.
I want to thank you, Murray. The fact that you're acting for Dean Maxwell reminds me of the definition of an acting dean, and I know it does not apply on either end in this case. An acting dean has been said to be a mouse learning to act like a rat. It does not apply on both ends. It is next my pleasure to introduce to you Professor John Field, Associate Dean of the School of Medicine and Professor of Physiology, who will talk to you from the point of view of the School of Medicine.
On behalf of Dean Melankoff and the School of Medicine, I want to welcome this conference to the UCLA Health Sciences Center, and in so doing, point out that the Health Sciences Center, which like most of the new Health Sciences Center seems a bit overwhelming spatially, has to grow still more. You're just before, had you come about 6 months later, parking would have been really a difficult thing compared to the easy and light task that it was this morning. The medical center, I might add, is really a 20th century development. And I'm reminded at conferences like this of the rather humble background that perhaps we should recall that the medical sciences had for about 2,000 years, from the Hippocratic period to, say, the mid-19th century. What the doctor did, what he did in attempting to take care of the patient and to relieve his distress, was much the same. Bleeding, blistering, and purging were major therapeutic procedures in the Hippocratic period. They were major therapeutic procedures in the late 19th century. The great change came, the great modification came, when scientific methodology, the use of planned, controlled experiments, began to be applied effectively and massively in medical investigation, when research became a large part of the activities of medical scholars. Research is just a process of learning beyond the boundaries of the known. And this conference represents one aspect of it, because a very critical part of that learning beyond the boundaries of the known consists in communication and in the getting together of people with background for fruitful and germinative interaction. And this conference, I'm sure, will mark such an occasion. And as such an occasion, it is a real and a critical part of the development of our knowledge of medical affairs and of medical problems. Please be assured that we will be delighted to see you in the School of Medicine at any time. And it's only about 400 yards down. So hoping that you will all be our guests, I will welcome you again for us. Thank you.
The Attorney General of California has for many years had a strong interest in enforcement, and I'm pleased to say in aspects of medicine and sociology of the narcotics problem. It's my great pleasure to introduce Stanley Mosk.
Dr. Wilner, distinguished guests, at the start of this year, California became the largest state in the Union. So on behalf of the nation's #1 state, I'm pleased to welcome all of you who have come from distant places to be with us today. Of course, being the largest state in the Union is not an unmixed blessing. We have, of course, the most and the best of everything here. We have the highest mountain and the lowest desert. We have more statesmen and more demagogues. We have more schools and a greater teacher shortage. We have more highways and more accidents. We have more people and more crimes. We have more medical research and more narcotic and dangerous drug problems. But we're indeed proud of our schools particularly, and of UCLA, Dr. Wilner, and this university for sponsoring what we hope will be a most significant meeting. As Dr. Wilner mentioned in his opening remarks, it was just 7 months ago, as a matter of fact 7 months ago today, that President Kennedy convened the White House Conference on Narcotic and Drug Abuse. He urged the delegates gathered in Washington for that purpose to, as the President said, let strong light dispel the appearances of controversy that have surrounded the problem. Now, the President's appeal followed a half-century of battle in which the foes of addiction frequently left the main war to engage in intramural skirmishes. To a warrior so inclined, the main weapon was a strident voice, backed up, of course, by the inevitable curriculum vitae and other impressive credentials. Other standard equipment included a sheaf of tailored statistics, short pamphlets with long bibliographies, and big magazine articles with small contents. The art of making the front page, while not a requirement for the battle, added considerably to the gladiator's intramural skill and reputation. It's to be hoped that this era has ended. Certainly, the White House Conference will have served a high national purpose if it proves only to have brought the cliques to the same table where reasonable men may moderate their discussions for the benefit of both society and the addict. This is particularly important to us in California, and that the effort hereafter be characterized by cooperation and coordination rather than consternation and confusion. Our state now has a documented addict population equal to the total population of such cities in our state as Chico, Visalia, San Marino, or Coronado. Should the spread of addiction halt today, this very day, and of course we know it will not, the present addict population would continue to tax the control and treatment capabilities of our state for many years to come. I'm pleased to see the emphasis on research at this conference. There is a need for reliable information. Good as California's programs are, and we think they're as good as any, in the detection, treatment, follow-up therapy, and supervision, there could be improvements if reliable information was available. But above all, I'm pleased to see the interaction of the White House Conference continued here at this meeting. We have ceased, it hopefully seems, to be questing in the several individual areas for a bold new approach or a simple cure. There may be such a thing, but to my way of thinking, the best bold new approach is the pooling of knowledge from the fields of law, science, and medicine, psychology, sociology, education, to be followed by a shirt-sleeve effort on the part of all concerned. The easier we can talk with each other, the easier the job will ultimately be. The University of California at Los Angeles and its sponsoring component parts, which seem too numerous or too multisyllable to mention, all deserve high praise for endeavoring to continue the enlightened discussions which were initiated at the White House Conference. I'm impressed with this array of talent here today, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity of welcoming you.
Thank you, Mr. Mosk, and gentlemen, for your comments. I am now at the 2/3 mark of my job. The last third is to turn this meeting over to Dr. John Clausen, who will chair the first general session. A word or two about our chairman might help you in understanding his role here. After a distinguished career in universities and in the Department of Defense during World War II and field of social research, Dr. Clausen came to the National Institute of Mental Health in 1948 and 49, and very soon after arriving there, began an interest in the role that the behavioral sciences, sociology and social psychology and cultural anthropology and the rest, might play in understanding the origins, the course, and the likely outcome of the pressing problems of society. And very early in that period, I know he became interested in the field of narcotics addiction and was probably responsible in those early days, more than any person in the National Institute of Mental Health, for developing and promoting interest outside the Institute as well as inside in this area. So we have a person who is, in some respects, spark plug of a great many interests in this field. In 1960, to the regret, I know, of NIMH, he left and came to the University of California, Berkeley, as director of the Institute of Human Development and professor of sociology. And it is now my great pleasure to turn this meeting over to Professor John A. Clausen, scholar and an old friend.
Thank you, Dan. I didn't realize that the chairman would not only get to make introductions, but would be so introduced in so flattering a manner. I should say now to work. We're running a bit late, and we want to have a brief break for a stretch after the first paper, so I shall say very little other than to introduce our speakers. Perhaps I could just mention that although the problem of drug use and drug abuse goes back to antiquity, and the problem first became acute in this country shortly after the Civil War, the history of drug addiction in the last 100 years, and particularly in the last 50, has been a history of changes. There have been new drugs, new laws, and new classes of addicts. As has already been mentioned, this is a multifaceted problem. As the cover of the program suggests, and as Mr. Mosk mentioned, there are a great many disciplines involved. There are a great many different perspectives involved. Therefore, it becomes important in opening a conference of this sort that we have an adequate overview of the various perspectives. Our session this morning is designed to give us that overview, an overview of the pharmacological and chemical aspects of the problem, the social and social psychological aspects, and the legal aspects. We shall start with the chemopharmacological approach to the addiction problem. And our speaker is one of the most distinguished physiologists, physicians, and pharmacologists working in this area. His contributions to the literature go back more than 50 years. After taking his MD at Cornell, Dr. Eddy entered medical practice for a time, then turned to a career of teaching and research. But even while in practice, one notes that his bibliography shows he was doing research and publishing. He served on the faculties of McGill University, the University of Alberta, the University of Michigan. In 1939, he went to the National Institutes of Health as chief pharmacologist, and subsequently was chief of the section on analgesics. Since his retirement, if one can speak of Dr. Eddy's retirement, since his retirement in 1960, he has become executive secretary of the Committee on Drug Addiction and Narcotics of the National Research Council. He served as technical advisor and special consultant to various commissions of the World Health Organization and the United Nations. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Nathan Eddy.
Dr. Clausen, ladies and gentlemen, seems to me particularly appropriate that the first three papers at this conference are three approaches to which are likely to have the greatest impact upon our understanding of, and consequently our handling of addiction and its problems. If you must decide the relative importance of the three approaches, I leave that to you. My place as the initial speaker, my scheduling as the initial speaker, is probably simply on the basis of seniority. I was talking with Dr. Field last night, and we were exchanging bits of background information, and after a while Dr. Field said, "Oh yes, I place you now, you're the grandfather of drug addiction research. Well, surely I am old enough to be rather an elderly grandfather, and perhaps I am an elder statesman in the field of addiction research. I'm not so sure that I like to be called the grandfather of it, because I don't know just what that means. I don't know what the progeny are. I was asked originally to talk about the history of drug addiction. I demurred because that has been done so many times by so many people, piecemeal more or less, but I couldn't see just what constructive contribution it could make to the conference. I elected to talk about to outline for you the efforts that have been made to obtain a non-addicting analgesic, and to tell you what I think the situation is today in that respect. It was 150 years ago that the German pharmacist Serturner isolated and identified morphine as the principal active ingredient of opium. But we waited many, many years for technological development and the ingenuity of chemists to apply that development, even to the extent of identifying the structure of morphine itself. The structure which we accept today was not described until 1925, and it was not confirmed by complete synthesis until 1952. Chemical manipulations of morphine during the 19th century dealt principally with study of its physical properties, means of identification of it as such, and so on. Toward the end of the century, the last quarter mostly, derivatives of morphine began to be described, but even then there was considerable doubt about the identity and purity of the compounds that were named, and much less knowledge about their pharmacological action. I think that the production and introduction of heroin can fairly be pinpointed as the first claim at a non-addicting analgesic. We know, of course, today that that's erroneous, but that is the way in which it came on the market. Dreeser and others claimed for it specific and unique properties with respect to respiration, and others claimed that it could be used safely without danger of the development of dependence, that it was a safe and satisfactory substitute for morphine in persons already addicted. These latter claims, of course, were based upon lack of knowledge or disregard of knowledge. We knew very little about cross-tolerance in those days. The fact that the individual addicted to morphine could be given heroin and suffered no withdrawal signs as he would have had he been given something like aspirin, let us say, they argued was a cure of the addiction. Since the individual showed no adverse effects, there was no particular reason for discontinuing the heroin. And until that was finally done, if it was done, the physician did not become aware that his patient was just as dependent or more so on the heroin as he had been on the morphine in the first place. Another factor in the development of the bad name of heroin arose from its introduction as an oral medicament. And when they rather shortly, changed to parenteral administration, not being very clear about the relationship between oral and parenteral doses, they used the same doses parenterally as they had been using orally, which were several times too large, much above the optimal dose for parenteral administration. And we all know today that the more excess narcotic you give, the faster physical dependence and tolerance develops, so that the bad name of heroin was very easily acquired. It probably would not have had a much worse name, perhaps not even a worse name in any way, had they realized that they did not need to use such doses parenterally and could have got along with a good deal less and consequently less rapid development of dependence. During the next quarter century, heroin was introduced in '98. During the next quarter century, in spite of the discouraging results with heroin, that it was really an addicting drug of at least the potency of morphine in that respect, chemists continued to make derivatives. One is particularly noteworthy, the production of a compound known as N-allyl norcodeine by Pohl in 1948. It was a production or a discovery that we should have paid a good deal of attention to, because it was the best clue then and it offered the best clue then and the best clue that we have now to the production of a non-addicting analgesic. We were not aware of its significance. He claimed that N-allyl norcodeine was an antagonist to especially the respiratory effect of morphine. That seemed like a very peculiar and bizarre phenomenon when the main structure of the compound was the same as codeine and closely related to morphine, both of which were respiratory depressants. His findings were hardly believed, and no one paid any attention to them. Surely they had no conception at the time that they had a clue to what we have been searching for a long time. 30 years later, the Merck chemists made the morphine analog, N-allyl normorphine, which is what we know now as nalorphine or naline, a more potent antagonist, but we still didn't realize its real significance with respect to a non-addicting analgesic. Still another 10 years or so elapsed before chemists in Switzerland, having made another antagonist in a different chemical series, noted that the amount of the antagonist necessary to oppose the analgesic effect of morphine on the one hand, or the respiratory depressant effect on the other hand, because each of these antagonists, insofar as they are antagonists, will counteract or abolish practically all of the effects of the narcotic itself, both of morphine and of morphine-allied substances. Well, these Swiss chemists noted that the ratios to oppose different effects of morphine were not the same, that they could abolish the respiratory depressant effect with a ratio of a narcotic to antagonist of 100 to 1, and yet when they changed the ratio to 20 to 1, analgesia was well retained. Excuse me. That suggested to us that perhaps there was a ratio which could be of narcotic to antagonist, which could be used clinically to abolish the side effects, the undesirable effects of morphine, perhaps even to eliminate or hold in abeyance physical dependence properties, and yet retain the analgesic potency of the morphine or the other narcotic with which the antagonist was combined. We asked Dr. Beecher and Dr. Lasagna, who were active in the field of evaluating analgesics at the time, to try out this idea, and they did. They used ratios of morphine to nalorphine of 3 to 1 and 5 to 1, and being the good scientists that they are, they insisted that they control their observations not only by giving morphine alone, but by giving nalorphine alone. Our primary objective was not attained. The morphine plus the nalorphine, either in the 5-to-1 ratio or the 3-to-1 ratio, gave as good analgesia as the morphine alone, but the side effects were just as frequent, just as severe as when we gave morphine alone. In those ratios, at least, side effects could not be abolished by the addition of the antagonist. We have since tried to abolish or hold in abeyance physical dependence properties by the addition of the antagonist to the narcotic, and for the most part we've failed there also. There is a slight trend in favor of an attenuation of physical dependence and tolerance, but it isn't sufficient to warrant, so far as we know now, the use of the mixtures in clinical medicine. But I said that they used the nalorphine alone as well as the morphine alone as controls, alternating them with the mixture in the same post-operative patients. And to the amazement of the people who were doing the work and all the rest of us, the nalorphine at an equal dose was as good an analgesic as the morphine itself. And there was the follow-up of the clue we had way back in 1914. Had we followed up the antagonist which was available at that time, we would have been farther along on the road to a non-addicting analgesic today than we are. Unfortunately, the nalorphine also had side effects, and its side effects were even worse than those of morphine. It produced the usual ones that we see with morphine, but it also produced disturbing psychic responses in the individuals, which they found terrifying and very disagreeable, so that it is not practical to use nalorphine as an analgesic on account of these side effects. Well, to go back a bit, during the years, beginning in 1929, for example, a very extensive program of the study of morphine itself was undertaken with the idea of trying to modify morphine in some way as to dissociate the analgesic and addicting properties of the morphine itself, either by addition or subtraction of substituents to the morphine molecule. I was involved in that program from its inception in 1929, and it has still been going on, is still going on to a certain extent today. Not only did we attempt to modify the morphine molecule itself, but we started at the other end, so to speak, and we began with simple molecules and tried to add appendages or substituents to them, hoping that somewhere along the line we would get the right combination of basic structure and outlying groups to bring out useful analgesic properties and hopefully avoid or not bring out the unfortunate or undesirable side effects, including addiction liability, of the morphine itself. We were not at all successful in this latter part of the program in the sense of coming up with a useful analgesic from the clinical standpoint. We did develop analgesic action in some of these simpler compounds, but none of them was sufficiently potent or sufficiently desirable in its other properties to warrant clinical trial. We learned a great deal about quantitative changes in the morphine picture, different parts of the morphine picture, by chemical modification, but we didn't significantly change the relationship between analgesic action and addiction liability. For the most part, the two ran parallel. When we increased or decreased analgesic potency of the resulting, brought about by changes in the morphine molecule, we increased or decreased in a similar fashion changes in addiction liability. There were minor exceptions, but nothing of any real significance. In 1949, the German chemist Greve, undertaking to synthesize morphine got as far as the production of morphinan. Morphine itself is a complex structure made up of 5 interlocking rings with some outlying structures or appendages, most of which appeared to be essential for the development of the morphine picture. As I've just said, we showed that quantitatively, these portions of the morphine picture could be changed by changing some of the outlying appendages. 2 Swiss chemists, well, let me say this, the morphinan left off one of the 5 rings of the morphine molecule and left off all of the appendages. It was simply the other 4 rings without any outlying structures. 2 Swiss chemists succeeded in adding on the other appendages, the appendages which are present in the morphine molecule, without the addition of the 5th ring. Again, perhaps to the surprise of us all, we discovered that it was not necessary to have that 5th ring, that actually the compound that was produced by synthesis, by total synthesis, like the morphine molecule but lacking the 5th ring, was an even better analgesic than morphine itself. Again, the chemists made a great many modifications of the morphinan molecule, or this advanced morphinan molecule. We examined over 100 of them, and again we found quantitative changes in the analgesic potency as the modifications were made, but again, for the most part, we found that changes in addiction liability or in physical dependence property paralleled the changes in analgesic action. There were some interesting findings along the way. For example, we had believed that the essential group on nitrogen of morphine was a methyl group, a single carbon, CH3. We had thought that if we changed it, or rather we had found that if we changed it to ethyl, a 2-carbon structure, or to propyl, a 3-carbon side chain, that analgesic action diminished. So that we felt that the methyl group on nitrogen was essential for morphine-like analgesic action. Curiously, since the trend was downward, no one went beyond propyl. But later on, after the antagonist, nalorphine, was produced, which is a 3-carbon, allyl is a 3-carbon structure, trying to find out to what extent they could modify the antagonistic potency of the morphine derivatives by the substituents on nitrogen, they added other alkyl groups. They added other more complicated groups like phenethyl and phenacetyl and benzyl and so on. We lengthened the carbon chain just to see what would happen, and we discovered, very interestingly, that when we got out to a 5 or 6 carbon chain, we had a better analgesic than we had when we started out, with only methyl on the nitrogen. We also found that when we put an air alkyl group, particularly phenethyl, and sometimes a modified phenethyl, like para-aminophenethyl or para-nitrophenethyl or something like that, we had a still better analgesic. So that methyl on nitrogen was not essential after all, was not the optimal group. We could produce much better analgesics by other modifications on nitrogen, and we could produce a whole host of antagonists of varying intensity by changing the particular grouping which was attached to the nitrogen. When morphinan came along, the chemists working with morphinan followed along along the same lines as the research on morphine. They put similar substituents on the nitrogen of morphinan, since it was a morphine-like structure, lacking one of its 5 rings. And they found that for the most part, the same changes took place in morphinan with respect to its activity as had taken place in the morphine series. When we went from methyl to ethyl to propyl, we decreased analgesic activity and we brought out antagonistic effect. If we went on to amyl or hexyl, analgesic activity came back. If we added on phenethyl or a paraminophenethyl or similar groups, we had a better analgesic than we had with our morphinan to start with. The two series of experiments, so far as with respect to chemical modification, went along more or less parallel. The essential point was, the two essential points were that we didn't need the full morphine structure to produce a good analgesic, and we didn't need just methyl on nitrogen. In fact, it was a good deal better not to have methyl on nitrogen if we were looking for potency with respect to analgesia. Realizing the lack of need for the full morphine structure, our own chemists, led by Dr. May at the National Institutes of Health, started a new series, starting from scratch, to synthesize toward morphinan, but not attain it. He made a 3-ring structure instead of the 4-ring structure which morphine constitutes. In other words, he lopped off another of the morphine rings. And we found that we still had a good analgesic. So, confirming that we didn't really need the morphine structure, we could use much simpler things. Dr. May and his associates have now made some 100 or so derivatives of his original benzomorphan, and again, on the whole, the quantitative changes in analgesic action in this benzomorphan series have paralleled more or less pretty well the quantitative changes which have occurred in the morphine, had occurred in the morphine and the benzomorphan and the morphinan series. But some further interesting developments have occurred along the way. In the meantime, there had been developed at the University of Michigan a screening program in monkeys to try to determine ahead of time what was likely to happen when one of these analgesics was given to man with respect to its addiction liability. The test consisted of substituting the new compound for morphine in an addicted monkey. The monkey becomes addicted and shows the same or very similar withdrawal phenomena when the addicting drug is withdrawn as does man. And it was believed, and we had good evidence to support it, that a compound which would relieve or suppress the abstinence phenomena in an addicted individual would itself become addicting. So a fairly simple technique was developed to addict monkeys to morphine, then start to withdraw them and substitute the new compound for the morphine and determine to what degree the developing morphine syndrome was suppressed. There had been reasonably good parallelism up to this time, on a qualitative basis certainly, and to some extent, to a fair extent on a quantitative basis, between these results in suppressing abstinence phenomena in the monkey and subsequent tests in man with respect to suppression of abstinence phenomena or the production of physical dependence. But when we tried the benzomorphans, we found that they didn't suppress the morphine abstinence syndrome, or they were very poor suppressants of the morphine abstinence syndrome. For example, a compound which has since gone on the market, the only one of the benzomorphans on the market today, which goes by the name of phenazocine, was tested in animals. It had an analgesic potency 10 times that of morphine. Subsequently tested in man, it had an analgesic potency, that is, a dose relationship of some 3 to 7 times greater than that of morphine. But in the monkey, it was only 1/5 as effective as morphine in suppressing abstinence phenomena. Well, this, on the basis of our previous experience, looked like a very striking dissociation between analgesia and physical dependence properties. And of course, we were very anxious to go to man to see if what we had observed would carry over. Unfortunately, it didn't carry over as we hoped. In post-addicts, the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, phenazocine had morphine-like effects. It was three times or so as potent as morphine in producing, perhaps even more so, the subjective effects of morphine in the post-addicts. It was 8 times or so more effective than morphine in suppressing morphine abstinence symptoms in addicted individuals, given to individuals on a chronic basis to try to produce a direct addiction. The dose could not be increased as rapidly as one does commonly with morphine. And when the drug was finally withdrawn, the abstinence syndrome which followed was a little less intense than that which follows comparable administration of morphine, but the differences were not striking. Perhaps there's a little trend in the direction of somewhat less intensity of physical dependence properties with phenazocine, but the difference is not striking. Other benzomorphans have been tried in the monkey and in man, and there is some evidence that in the group there is some dissociation between analgesia and physical dependence property. There is one compound to which I would like to draw your attention particularly. It is the nearest, the compound which is most closely related to morphine in its structure in the benzomorphan series. It has, with respect to its ring structure and the appendages, with respect to its optical configuration, the same properties as morphine itself. It's approximately equivalent to morphine as an analgesic in animals and in man. Given to the monkey, it produces scarcely no suppression of abstinence phenomena at all. Given to post-addicts, it is equivalent to morphine in its production of morphine-like subjective effects, but given to addicted individuals, it fails to suppress morphine abstinence until you give twice the amount of morphine to which the individual is accustomed. So that, again, in man, with this particular compound, the abstinence suppressant potency of the compound fails, in spite of the fact that it will produce by itself the subjective effects of morphine, and given chronically will produce physical dependence, though to somewhat less extent than does morphine itself under comparable conditions. The difference is a little greater than with the phenazocine that we described a moment ago. Now, to come to the present situation. I've mentioned the fact that in the morphine series, the chemists have made a whole long list of antagonists by modification on the nitrogen of morphine. Similarly, in the morphinan series, they've made a long list of antagonists with modifications of the group on the nitrogen. And again, in the benzomorphan series, we have made up to the present time, or there have been made up to the present time, something like 25 different antagonists in the benzomorphan series by variations on the nitrogen. Because of the suspicion of some degree of dissociation in the benzomorphan series between analgesia and physical dependence, we have most recently been concentrating on the antagonists in the benzomorphan series. Our thinking has been this. We tried the mixture of morphine with nalorphine and did not succeed in offsetting the side effects or the addiction liability. But we found that the antagonist was an analgesic. Now, it seemed possible that if the antagonists were analgesics themselves, and I should have said that along the line we had shown that the antagonist, the nalorphine at least, was not capable of producing physical dependence. Rather, given to an addicted individual, it precipitates an abstinence syndrome instead of suppressing it or supporting it. That somewhere along the line there might be in one of these antagonists a combination of antagonistic action and other properties, whereby the antagonist property would be sufficient to hold in abeyance the ability of the compound to produce physical dependence. But the analgesic property of the compound would be sufficient to be a useful practical analgesic, and hopefully we would not have too severe side effects. We began by trying 3 members of the morphine series, which varied in their antagonistic potency from almost nothing to several times the potency of nalorphine itself. We tried 3 members of the morphinan series, which varied similarly from a very weak antagonist to one which was several times more potent as an antagonist than nalorphine itself. When the antagonistic property was very weak, we got morphine-like effects when we went to post-addicts. We got the development of physical dependence, just as we did with morphine itself, or nearly to the same extent. When we had a strong antagonist, we got the bizarre, unpleasant side effects that had occurred with nalorphine. So that we have not been very successful with the antagonists in the morphine series or in the morphinan series, except that we have confirmed the fact that in spite of the occurrence of antagonistic, or in spite of the existence of antagonistic properties against the other narcotics, against morphine and morphine-like substances, these antagonists are capable of relieving pain themselves. Then, as I said, with the suspicion that in the benzomorphan series we might have some dissociation of analgesia and physical dependence, we began to try some of the benzomorphan antagonists, and we have now tried 3 or 4 of them, ranging from one which is perhaps a 5th or 6th of the potency of nalorphine as an antagonist, to one which is very much more potent than nalorphine as an antagonist, probably 6 or 7 times more potent. These antagonists in the benzomorphan series also are analgesics. They vary in the range of their analgesic potency in somewhat the same way that they vary in the range of their analgesic potency. The one which is less effective than nalorphine as an antagonist is less effective than morphine as an analgesic. It takes some 30 or 40 milligrams against postoperative pain to produce the same pain relief that 10 milligrams of morphine will produce. But it hasn't produced the unpleasant, disagreeable, disturbing side effects which nalorphine itself produces. It has been tried in the addicts population at Lexington, both in post-addicts free of narcotics, in addicts stabilized on morphine, and so on, and it has not developed any significant degree of physical dependence property, morphine-like addictiveness in that population. So that to that extent, in that compound, just as in nalorphine, analgesia and physical dependence properties have been dissociated, and hopefully, with broader experience, the lesser degree, the absence of the unpleasant side effects, the disturbing side effects, will make it a practical clinical possibility. We've also tried another in the benzomorphan series, which is very much more potent, and this is perhaps the most surprising thing in the whole series. it is 6 or 7 times more potent than nalorphine as an antagonist. Its effective analgesic dose is of the order of 1/4 to 1/2 milligram, to be equivalent to 10 milligrams of morphine. In other words, it is 20 to 40 times more potent as an analgesic than is morphine itself. As an antagonist, it is more potent than the most potent of the morphine or morphinan antagonists which we had studied previously, and all of which produced very severe, disturbing, unpleasant side effects. At the morphine equivalent analgesic dose, this compound has not produced the unpleasant, undesirable side effects. They can be produced by increasing the dose up to the range of about 2 milligrams. That is a 4 to 8-fold increase. But we couldn't possibly increase the dose of morphine in a non-tolerant individual 4 to 8 times. And in the way in which these things are marketed today, there is practically no risk, if this material came on the market, that anyone would accidentally increase the dose 4 or 8 times, so that the spread between the 1/4 or 1/2 milligram of the compound, which will produce the equivalent of 10 milligrams of morphine for, for pain relief. And the risk of increasing the dose accidentally up to the milligram to 2 milligrams level, which will or may produce disturbing side effects, is not very great. This compound has also been tried in Lexington at the Addiction Research Center and is somewhat comparable to the weaker antagonists in its effects on their population. They have not come up with a final conclusion with respect to its status as an addicting agent, and consequently I'm not going to give any judgment as to where it stands exactly. But the results to date would suggest that its addictiveness at most is of a low order, and it again may be a practical clinical analgesic of good potency with little or no addiction liability. In other words, in these series of antagonists, we have dissociated analgesia and physical dependence properties. And hopefully in the benzomorphan series, we have done so without the occurrence of such severe side effects as would interfere with their practical application. Let me say then, in summing up, that the group with which I started out 30 years ago to study or to try to dissociate analgesia and addiction liability met with many frustrations and not much success. We were often referred to as a dedicated group who would not give up. But I think it is fair to say that we have finally met with some success. Now, just one more thought before we get too optimistic about all this. Assuming that we do have an analgesic, a practical analgesic, without significant physical dependence properties, that is not going to solve the addiction problem overnight. It's going to be a boon to the physician and to the patient, because he can use the compound, if we're right, with relatively safety and without the worry of producing a physically dependent patient if he has to prolong the administration. But we will still have the opium producers. We will still have the economic problems if we try to ban opium production and try to get the farmers switched over to some other crop. We will still have the machinery and the know-how for the making and the distribution of heroin, and we will still have the problems of the illicit traffic. We will have helped medicine, but we will not have solved the problem.
Thank you, Dr. Eddy, for this introduction to the nature of our problem, to the pharmacological and chemical aspects of the problem and the implications that these have. I had been tempted to introduce Dr. Eddy as the Dean of American pharmacologists working in this field. He was characterized by someone else as the grandfather. I should have said at the start that when in government anyone wanted an expert, Dr. Eddy was always that expert. We shall now have a brief stretch. Let me suggest, since we're running a bit late, exactly 15 minutes late in fact, that we try to hold that stretch to 10 minutes, and then we reassemble for the final two papers on the morning session.